The morning Kathleen Brennan's stepfather threw her trunk into the Dakota snow, the thermometer outside Bismarck read 14 below zero. It was February 1878 and she'd turned 16 3 days earlier. Her mother stood at the kitchen window, face turned away, while Thomas Brennan pointed toward the horizon and told Kathleen she'd brought shame enough and could make her own way now. The trunk held to dresses, a wool blanket, her father's old hammer, and for dollars in coins her grandmother had sent before she died. Kathleen dragged it half a mile before her hands went numb. She'd been accused of meeting a railroad worker behind the stable, which she hadn't done. But her stepfather's mind was made once his sister planted the seed. Standing there on the frozen road with everything she owned, Kathleen did what any frontier girl raised hard would do. She started figuring the town lots around Bismarck were going for $25 minimum, and boarding houses wanted $1.50 per week, which meant her $4 wouldn't last until March. She'd heard the Larson boys talking about how their uncle had lived in a dugout for 2 years down in Nebraska and never paid a cent for the land, just carved it right into a hillside south of Omaha. The notion stuck with her as she walked toward the settlement, her feet losing feeling inside boots that had been her mother's. By noon, she'd found work washing dishes at the Northern Pacific Dining Hall, which paid 35 cents a day, plus one meal. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Halterman, let her sleep on flour sacks in the storeroom for 2 weeks, while Kathleen looked for something permanent. That's when she saw the eroded bank along Apple Creek, 3 miles west of town. The land wasn't anybody's yet, far as the county recorder could tell her. Just open territory along the creek where the spring floods had carved a natural wall about 9 ft high. Kathleen walked out there on a Sunday in late February, studying the southern exposure and the cottonwoods above. She'd grown up watching her real father, Michael Brennan, build everything from chicken coops to lintos before the fever took him in '74. He taught her how to read wood grain and judge a foundation and understand that water always finds the lowest point. Standing at the base of that creek bank, she could see the whole design in her mind. A dugout cut into the south-facing slope, 8 feet deep, maybe 10 feet wide, with the front wall built up from the bank, roof made from cottonwood poles covered in prairie sod. Total cost, if she did it right, maybe $8 to $10 for nails, a couple boards for the door and one window, and some tar paper if she could spare it. Here's where the story gets interesting, though. And if you've ever wondered how people survived when everything got stripped away, you'll want to hear how this 16-year-old girl solved a problem that had stumped men twice her age. Kathleen started digging on March 3, 1878. The ground was still frozen solid the first 6 and down, so she built fires to thaw sections, then dug while the earth was soft, then built another fire. She worked before dawn and after her shift at the dining hall, which meant she was getting maybe 4 hours of sleep. The blisters on her palms opened and closed and opened again. Mrs. Halterman noticed her hands and asked what full project she'd gotten into. When Kathleen explained, the older woman just shook her head and said dugouts were for desperate men and sod-busters who didn't know any better, not for girls who ought to be finding husbands. That was the first piece of doubt Kathleen heard, but it wouldn't be the last. Vera Hauptmann ran the lumber yard, and he'd come from Prussia in '69 with ideas about proper construction. When Kathleen came in asking about 6-penny nails and what kind of wood would hold up underground, he set down his pencil and studied her like she was simple. He'd built 17 houses round Bismarck, he told her, and not one of them involved digging into the earth like a prairie dog. The moisture alone would rot anything she put down there in side tiers. The cave-ins would happen in spring when the snow melted, and even if she got it built, the whole thing would be darker than a root cellar and twice as damp. He sold her the nails anyway, £1.50 for $6, but he made sure she knew she was wasting her money. Frank Cordell, who owned the land 2 miles upstream, rode by while she was digging and stopped to watch. He'd homesteaded that stretch in '72 and built a proper frame house with a shingled roof. Lost 3 fingers to frostbite his first winter. but kept at it until he had 80 acres under cultivation. He sat on his horse, looking down at the hole Kathleen had carved about 5 feet into the bank, and asked if she understood that prairie winters could drop to 40 below for weeks at a time. She'd need a real house with double walls and a proper stove, he said, not some hole in the ground. Dugouts were what you built when you first arrived and didn't know better. They were temporary. They weren't meant to last, but the skeptic who bothered Kathleen most was Father Dunn, the Catholic priest who'd known her family since they'd arrived in 75. He caught her after Mass one Sunday in late March and asked about her living situation. When she told him about the dugout, his face went through about 4 different expressions before settling on concerned. He'd seen too many settlers lose everything to poor planning. He said pride was one sin, but foolishness was worse because it affected more than just yourself. A young woman living alone 3 miles from town in a dirt shelter. What happened when she got sick or injured? Or when winter came and she couldn't get to town for a week straight? He could help her find a proper situation. Maybe as a hired girl for one of the families with small children. It would be Christian charity on both sides. Kathleen thanked him for his concern and kept digging. The thing nobody understood, the detail that separated her approach from every failed dugout they'd seen, was what she'd learned watching her father work. Michael Brennan had built a root cellar into the hillside behind their Pennsylvania farmhouse when Kathleen was 9, and he'd explained the whole process while she handed him tools. The earth is either your friend or your enemy, he'd told her. Depending on how you treat it, you can't fight the water, so you work with it. You can't ignore the cold, so you use it. And you never ever assume the ground will stay where you put it without help. She dug the main room 8 feet deep into the bank, sloping the floor toward the entrance at a grade of about 1 inch per foot. That meant water would drain out instead of pooling inside. The back wall and side walls she carved at a slight angle, leaning inward maybe 10, which gave them structural strength and made cave-ins less likely. Every night she'd tamp the walls with a flatboard, compressing the earth until it was solid as brick. The Dakota soil was heavy clay mixed with glacial till, and once you compacted it properly, it held like concrete. But here's where she did something different, something she'd never seen in any of the dugouts around town. She dug a separate channel along the east wall, about 8 in wide and 10 in deep, running from the back corner to the entrance. This channel sat below the main floor level and would catch any moisture that seeped through the walls, directing it straight out the door. Then she dug a second channel outside the entrance, creating a drainage ditch that would carry water away from the structure during spring thaw and heavy rains. The whole system was gravity-fed. No pumps needed. Working on the same principle as the aqueducts the Romans had built 2,000 years earlier. She'd read about those in a book her teacher had loaned her before her stepfather pulled her from school. By mid-April, she'd excavated the main space and started on the front wall. She couldn't afford cut lumber for the whole thing, so she used creek stone for the lower 4 feet, mortaring them with mud mixed with prairie grass for binding. The grass idea came from watching sparrows build nests. They used mud and dry grass in a ratio that created something stronger than either material alone. Kathleen tested different mixtures until she found that 2 parts clay, 1 part grass, and just enough water to make it workable gave her a mortar that dried hard as plaster. The upper portion of the front wall she framed with cottonwood poles she'd cut from the grove upstream, leaving a space for the door and a window opening about 2 feet square. She bought 1 actual door from Hopman's yard, a damaged pine door someone had ordered and then rejected because the frame was warped. Cost her $1.20. The window she couldn't afford to buy, so she traded 2 weeks of Saturday mornings helping Mrs. Halterman with laundry in exchange for small panes of glass salvaged from a building that had burned down. She set them in the window opening using the same clay grass mortar, sealing the gaps with pine pitch she'd collected from the cottonwoods. The roof was the trickiest part, and this is where a lot of dugouts failed. Most settlers just laid poles across the opening and piled sod on top, which worked until the first heavy rain turned everything into mud that eventually collapsed. Kathleen understood she needed a system that would shed water while supporting. The weight of 2 feet of sod, she cut 23 cottonwood poles, each about 7 in diameter and 14 feet long. She'd learned from her father that cottonwood wasn't ideal for structural work because it rotted faster than oak or pine, but it was what grew along Apple Creek. And she wasn't about to spend $3 on lumber she could get free. She debarked each pole using a borrowed draw knife, working the blade in long strips until the wood was smooth and white. Then she rubbed them down with a mixture of linseed oil and tar she'd bought from the hardware store for $160. That treatment would buy her. A few years before rot set in, she laid the poles across the opening, spacing them about 8 in apart, running them from the back wall to the front stone wall. Then came the critical layer that nobody else thought to include. She'd saved up newspapers for 2 months, getting old, editions from the dining hall and the general store, and she had a stack about 3 feet high. She laid those papers across the poles and overlapping sheets, creating a barrier that would slow water penetration and add insulation. Over the newspapers, she spread a layer of prairie grass, dried and packed tight. Then came the sod. Cutting sod is brutal work that'll wreck your back if you don't pace yourself. Kathleen used a spade to cut strips about 3 feet long and 12 in wide, slicing down about 4 in deep where the root mass was thickest. Each piece weighed maybe 30 pounds. She'd cut for pieces, haul them to the roof, then rest. Cut for more, haul them up, rest. It took her a week working evenings and Sundays to get the whole roof covered in 2 layers. The second layer laid perpendicular to the first, so the seams didn't line up. The finished structure measured 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 9 feet long inside. The ceiling height at the back wall was just over 6 feet, sloping up to 7.5 feet at the front. Total cost by the time she'd bought nails, the door, linseed oil, tar, and a few other supplies came to $945. She moved in on May 6, 1878, carrying her trunk, the flour sacks Mrs. Holterman had let her keep, and a stub of a candle. That first night, the dugout was cold and dark and smelled like wet earth. She lay on the flour sacks, wondering if Father Dunn and Vera Hopman and Frank Cordell had been right. Maybe this was foolishness. Maybe she'd wasted her time and money on something that had proved unlivable before summer ended. Then she woke up the next morning and realized something remarkable. The temperature outside had dropped to 38 overnight. Cold enough that she'd seen frost on the grass inside the dugout, though. It felt maybe 55 and she hadn't even started a fire yet. The earth itself was insulating the space, holding the heat from the previous day and releasing it slowly through the night. She'd read about this principle in the same book that taught her about Roman aqueducts. Thermal mass. The soil surrounding her shelter contained millions of tons of earth that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back during the night, moderating the temperature without any input from her. If you've been following along, you're probably wondering how this connects to the firewood problem mentioned at the start. Hold on to that thought because the winter of 1878-79 would test every assumption people had made about Kathleen Brennan and her $10 hole in the ground. Summer came hard that year. By July, the temperature was hitting 95 most afternoons, hot enough that Mrs. Holterman sent the kitchen staff home early twice a week. Because the dining hall was unbearable, Kathleen would walk back to her dugout in the blazing heat, stripped down to her shift, and step into a space that stayed between 65 and 70 no matter what the sun was doing outside. She'd set up a rope bed frame against the east wall and hung shelves from the support poles, a small table made from scrap lumber, 2 chairs she'd traded dishwashing for, an old stove cracked across the top but functional that she'd bought from a family moving back east for $3. The dugout stayed comfortable through August and September while other folks complained about the heat. Then October came, and with it, the first serious test. The rain started on October 17th and didn't let up for 4 days. Not a gentle soaking rain, but the kind of downpour that turns roads into rivers and makes you wonder if Noah had been on too. Something. Vera Hopman's lumberyard flooded. Frank Gordell lost a storage shed to the wind and water. 3 families in town had their basement fill up with runoff from the hills. Kathleen sat in her dugout, listening to the rain hammer the sod roof, watching through her little window as Apple Creek rose from its normal 12th depth to nearly 8 feet. The water came to within 30 yards of her entrance before it stopped rising. Inside, though, dry as a church on Tuesday. The drainage channel along the east wall caught the moisture that seeped through the back wall and directed it out the entrance where it joined the exterior ditch and flowed downhill into the creek. Maybe a 4 cup of water total made it onto her main floor. She wiped it up with a rag and kept cooking her dinner. Father Dunn came by when the rain stopped. Checking on families who lived outside town, he found Kathleen hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between 2 cottonwoods, and you could see the surprise on his face that she was still there, and the place was still standing. He asked if she'd had any trouble with the storm. She showed him the drainage system, explaining how the channels worked and why the sod roof hadn't collapsed like he'd worried about. He stood there in his wet cassock, nodding slowly, and admitted he'd been wrong about at least one thing. The structure was sounder than he'd expected. But winter was coming, he reminded her, and that it'd be the real test. Kathleen had already thought about winter. She'd spent October gathering firewood from the cottonwood grove, and the scattered stands of elm and ash she'd found along the creek. She'd cut dead wood mostly using a borrowed crosscut saw, sectioning the logs into lengths that had fit her little stove. By early November, she had a pile about 6 feet high and 8 feet wide stacked outside the entrance, covered with an old canvas tarp she'd found abandoned near the railroad tracks. That's when she discovered the problem that would change everything. The first snow came November 12th, just a dusting of 2 in that melted by afternoon. But it was enough to soak the tarp covering her firewood, and when she went to get wood that evening, she found the outer layer wet and starting to freeze. The wood would still burn, but wetwood smokes something terrible and produces maybe half the heat of dry wood. She brought the wet pieces inside to dry by the stove, but that meant she was always 1 day behind, burning wood that wasn't fully seasoned while trying to dry tomorrow's supply. By mid-November, she'd reorganized the wood into smaller piles, trying to keep more of it under cover, but she was running out of canvas, and the snow was coming more frequently. Vera Hopman sold tarps for $120 each, which she couldn't spare. Frank Gordell had suggested she stack the wood inside the dugout, but that would have taken up half her living space, and the fire danger wasn't worth it. She was sitting at her table one evening in late November, staring at the drainage channel along the east wall when the solution came to her. That channel, which had worked perfectly during the October rains, was just sitting there doing nothing for the next 6 months. It was 8 in wide, 10 in deep, and ran the entire 9 feet length of the dugout. If she built a wooden cover for it and sealed it properly, she'd have a wood storage space that held maybe 2 weeks worth of firewood, kept completely dry and protected from snow and rain. The next day, she bought 8 feet of 1 by 12 pine from Hopman's yard for $80, had him rip it into 3 in widths, and spent the evening cutting and fitting boards to cover the drainage channel. She made the cover in sections, each about 2 feet long, so she could access different parts of the channel, depending on which wood she needed. Where the boards met the dirt walls, she sealed the gaps with the same clay grass mortar she'd used. For the window, the system worked better than she'd hoped. She could stack split wood in the channel, lay the boards over it, and walk across them like a floor. The wood stayed bone dry even during the worst storms. The earth kept it from freezing solid, which meant it was always ready to burn. And because the channel ran along the interior wall, she could access her wood supply without ever stepping outside into a blizzard. But she took it one step further, and this is the detail that probably saved her life that winter. She realized that if she cut a small opening in the back corner of the wooden cover, where it met the back wall of the dugout, she could direct the heat from her stove into the channel. The warm air would circulate through the wood storage area, drying any moisture that did manage to seep in, then rise back into the main living space. Essentially, She turned her drainage channel into a heat distribution system that also dried her firewood. December hit like a freight train. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero on December 22nd and stayed below zero for the next 11 days. The kind of cold where your breath freezes in your beard, where exposed skin goes numb in under a minute, where the trees crack like gunshots from the ice expanding inside them. Mrs. Halterman closed the dining hall for a week because nobody could keep the building warm enough to work in. Families in town burned through their winter with supply twice as fast as they'd planned. Kathleen burned maybe half what she'd expected because the dugout needed so little heat to stay comfortable. The earth temperature at 8 feet deep stays around 55 year-round in that latitude, which meant she was starting from a much warmer baseline than anyone in a frame house. She'd fire the stove in the morning and again in the evening, bringing the inside temperature up to maybe 68, and the thermal mass of the surrounding earth would hold that warmth for hours. The firewood stayed perfectly dry in the covered channel, seasoning even better as the winter progressed, while other folks were burning wetwood and green wood and fence posts, and whatever else they could find. Kathleen had a steady supply of dry cotton, wood, and ash that caught quick and burned hot. She made a decision in mid-January that she still thinks about. Mrs. Halterman had reopened the dining hall, but business was slow and she had to let two workers go. She kept Kathleen on but cut her hours to 3 days a week, which meant less income right when Kathleen needed to be buying food supplies to last through the rest of winter. Most of her firewood was still intact though, and she knew Frank Cordell and several other families were running low. She loaded up a hand sled with a week's worth of dry wood and dragged it to Cordell's place on January 18th when the temperature was sitting at 12 below. She didn't ask for money, just offered the wood and trade for whatever he thought was fair. He stared at the bone-dry split cotton wood like she was offering gold bars, then went inside and came back with a smoked ham, 2 pounds of cornmeal, a jar of preserved beans, and 6 pounds of oats, more food than she could have bought with 2 weeks' wages. Word got around fast. By February, she was trading firewood to 5 different families, always getting more in return than the wood was worth because dry firewood in a Dakota winter is worth its weight in just about anything. She never took advantage, never gouged prices, just offered fair trades and helped people who'd been caught short by the brutal weather. Vera Hopman came by in late February to buy wood. This was the same man who told her dugouts were for prairie dogs and desperate sodbusters. He stood at her entrance, looking past her at the neat interior with the stove going and the covered wood channel, and the shelves organized with supplies, and he asked how much she'd charge for regular deliveries through the rest of winter. She told him 3 days' worth of wood for $1 worth of nails and hardware. He agreed immediately and asked if she'd considered that her design might work for other purposes. What he meant was storage. The Bismarck merchants were always struggling with where to keep goods that couldn't tolerate the temperature swings of frame buildings, root vegetables, for instance, apples, potatoes, seed grain. Anything that would freeze in a regular shed during winter or spoil in the heat during summer. A dugout with proper drainage and ventilation could maintain a steady 50 to 60 year-round, which was perfect for long-term storage. Hopman proposed a deal. He'd pay for materials if Kathleen would oversee the construction of a storage dugout behind his lumber yard, using the same techniques she'd developed for her own place. She'd get to dollars a week during construction, plus a percentage of whatever he charged people to store goods there once it was operational. She agreed, but only if she could hire Frank Cordell's eldest son to help with the digging, since she'd learned that trying to excavate and work full-time at the dining hall was a recipe for exhaustion. They broke ground in March and had the storage dugout completed by May. It was considerably larger than Kathleen's shelter, measuring 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep, and 12 feet high at the entrance. The drainage system was the same principle, just scaled up. Multiple channels running along the walls, directing any moisture toward the entrance with a covered wood storage area along one side. That had been used for keeping his premium lumber dry. Before we get to what happened next, let me ask you to do something if you're finding this story valuable. If you're seeing techniques here that you've never heard explained quite this way, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We're documenting frontier knowledge that's disappearing from public memory, and every subscription helps us preserve these stories for people who understand that the old ways weren't just about survival, they were about solving problems with intelligence and observation instead of money and convenience. Hit that subscribe button if you believe this kind of wisdom still matters. The storage dugout became profitable within 2 months. Min was charging 15 cents per week for a storage space about 4 feet square. And by July, he had 12 customers storing everything from seed potatoes to preserved meat to bolts of fabric that couldn't tolerate heat. The steady temperature and low humidity meant spoilage rates dropped to almost nothing. One merchant told him he'd lost 30% of his apple supply the previous winter to freezing and rot. That year, storing the apples in the dugout, he lost less than 5%. Kathleen's share came to about $4 a month, which doesn't sound like much until you remember she was still making 35 cents a day at the dining hall. The passive income from the storage dugout nearly doubled what she could earn from active work, and it gave her something else more valuable than money: proof. Father Dunn visited in August 1879 with a young couple from Illinois. The husband, Robert Callahan, had worked as a stonemason but didn't know prairie construction. Kathleen spent 3 days teaching him her father's principles: how to read land for drainage, how to cut south-facing slopes, how to angle walls for stability, and build drainage channels. She helped them find a site along the Heart River and oversaw initial excavation. The Callahans finished in October 1879 and lived there for years. Robert built 6 more dugouts using Kathleen's designs. None failed, flooded, or collapsed. By 1881, Kathleen had overseen the construction of 14 dugouts around Bismarck and into the surrounding Dakota territory. She'd saved enough to buy the land along Apple Creek, filing a homestead claim that gave her legal title to 160 acres. She married Erik Svensson in June of 1882, a Norwegian immigrant who'd come to farm wheat. They built a frame house in 1883, but kept the original dugout for storage. The covered channel meant they always had dry wood ready, and the steady temperature preserved their food supplies with minimal waste. The original dugout stood until at least 1904. A photograph from around 1898 shows the structure intact, with prairie grass covering the sill roof. The drainage ditch is visible, worn deeper by years of directing water away. Someone later added a frame addition onto the front, creating a hybrid structure. Modern engineers have confirmed what Kathleen understood instinctively: earth-sheltered buildings can reduce heating and cooling costs by 60 to 70% compared to conventional construction. The Earth's constant temperature at depth around 55 in that latitude provides thermal inertia that manufactured insulation can't match. A properly designed earth-sheltered home can maintain comfortable temperatures, using 1/3 the energy of a frame house. The drainage channels she used are the same principle employed in modern French drain systems. The clay-rest mortar was a natural fiber reinforced composite using the same engineering as modern fiberglass materials. The covered wood storage that doubled as heat distribution. That's passive solar design combined with heat recovery ventilation concepts. That wouldn't be formally studied until the 1970s, but the real innovation, the thing that separated Kathleen's approach from every failed dugout built by settlers who thought they knew better, was this: she paid attention to what worked instead of what she'd been told should work. When everyone said you couldn't live comfortably in a hole in the ground, she tested that assumption and found it wanting. When they said the earth would be her enemy, she turned it into her greatest ally. When they said a 16-year-old girl thrown out by her family couldn't make it alone on the frontier, she proved that observation and intelligence mattered more than age or gender or anybody's opinion about what was proper. There's a letter in the Bismarck archives from Father Dunn to his bishop in 1885, where he reflects on frontier settlement. He mentions Kathleen specifically, noting that she taught him about humility, He'd presumed to know better about what shelter she needed, when in fact she'd understood the land better than men with twice her experience. Vera Hopman's storage dugout operated until 1912, nearly 35 years after Kathleen built the first one. Frank Cordell gave a speech at a county fair in 1905, calling her dugout an example of frontier ingenuity that solved real problems with limited resources. The last documented mention of Kathleen appears in a Montana census from 1920, listing her as a widow at age 58. Her occupation, farm woman. No mention of the dugouts or the families she'd taught. That knowledge passed into local folklore and historical archives. What strikes me about Kathleen's story isn't just the technical innovation. It's that she trusted her own observation over everyone's assumptions. Every authority told her it wouldn't work. Every expert said she'd fail, and she listened politely. Then did it anyway because she'd studied the problem instead of repeating what she'd heard. That winter, when temperatures hit 40 below and families burned furniture to stay warm, Kathleen sat in her $10 dugout with dry firewood and the earth keeping her shelter comfortable. She'd spent $945 and created something that influenced frontier architecture for 30 years. She did it by understanding principles and applying them in new ways. The earth provides thermal stability, water flows downhill, drywood burns hotter. These weren't revolutionary ideas. They were basic physics applied with intelligence and persistence. The frontier's gone, but the problems Kathleen solved haven't disappeared. We still need shelter that works in extreme conditions, storage that protects supplies from temperature and moisture. We still face skeptics who say the conventional way is the only way, and we still have the same choice. Listen to people who claim to know better or pay attention to what works. Kathleen chose observation over authority, testing over assumption. That $10 dugout stood for at least 26 years. The drainage system she developed is still best practice for earth-sheltered construction. The thermal mass principles she relied on are taught as established science. None of it was magic. It was a young woman who'd lost everything, who understood the old ways might work in new contexts, and who had courage to ignore everyone saying it was impossible. Real knowledge comes from paying attention to how things actually work. Intelligence matters more than authority. Sometimes the person everyone expects to fail has already figured out what the experts haven't. Kathleen walked away from that frozen road with $4 and a trunk by spring. She'd built shelter that changed how people thought about construction. By winter, she'd proven everyone wrong. By the following summer, she was teaching others so. When someone tells you it can't be done, remember the girl who built a $10 dugout and kept her firewood dry all winter. Remember that observation beats assumption, that intelligence solves problems money can't, and that sometimes the best innovations come from people who have nothing to lose. And if you found value in this story, subscribe to this channel. We're preserving the knowledge that built this country. These pioneers didn't have YouTube or Home Depot. They had observation, intelligence, and willingness to test assumptions. That combination changed the world once. It can do it again. The dugout's still there in photographs, grass growing on the roof, the drainage ditch worn smooth. The window where Kathleen looked out during those Dakota winters, knowing she'd made the right choice. It stands as proof that the experts aren't always right, that age doesn't determine ability, and that sometimes a 16-year-old girl with a hammer knows more about survival than everyone who claimed to know better. That's not just frontier history, that's how real knowledge works.